We're now going to consider the idea of historical links between civilizations. So the idea that civilizations inherit from each other, for example, that Western civilization is derived from classical civilization. So in Hager's theory of civilizations, the first stage of his 61 stages of civilizations is the origin of the light in an earlier civilization. So that very much expresses the idea that each civilization gets its start from an earlier civilization. And we saw this also, for example, in the theory of Toynbee, that an earlier civilization can provide the religious ideas to the internal proletariat that the internal proletariat uses to construct a universal church. And those religious ideas can then go to the next civilization. And Toynbee and also Quigley, based upon him, construct these family trees of civilizations. So, for example, the Minoan, or also called the Aegean or the Cretan civilization, but the Minoan civilization of around 2000 to 1000 BC gave rise to the classical civilization. For example, it provided a lot of its early mythology, and the classical civilization then gave rise to Western civilization. And furthermore, the Western civilization also derived some ideas from what Toynbee calls the Syriac civilization, so the Middle Eastern civilization. So we're particularly talking about Christianity here. And that the Syriac civilization in turn derived some ideas from the Egyptian civilization and was in some sense a development of it. So this is just a part of the Quigley and Toynbee family tree, showing how there's this complex pattern of inheritance or historical links between civilizations. And we're going to consider three issues to do with this. So firstly, we'll talk about the idea of pseudomorphosis. This is a Spenglerian idea that civilizations don't actually inherit from each other. They can take ideas from other civilizations, but they always kind of squeeze them into a shape that suits their own particular worldview. So there's no derivation of one civilization from another. Each civilization remains entirely discrete and distinct and incomparable with any other civilization, which is what Spengler insists upon. So although we can definitely see that some ideas in Western civilization are taken from the classical, they've been squeezed into a different shape. We'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. And then the second issue is kind of a counter argument to this, or completely opposite perspective, that in fact what people like not only Spengler but Quigley and Toynbee and Hager and so on identify as separate civilizations are actually just phases within the development of a single civilization. So they're just reconstitutions of that civilization, a renewal and a reconstitution of the civilization. So we'll talk about that. And lastly, we'll consider what's sometimes known as the Black Athena hypothesis. This is the idea that Western civilization, so modern civilization, is based upon earlier African and Asiatic civilizations. So, and even that it's based on early black civilizations. And we'll go into what those ideas are. And the Black Athena hypothesis also implies that this debt that Western civilization owes to Asian and African civilizations, even Black African civilizations, has been overlooked or even deliberately suppressed. So we'll talk about that. Okay, pseudomorphosis is a term from geology. Crystals have a characteristic shape. So I've shown here one crystal which has that characteristic shape that it grows into, and here's another crystal that grows into a different shape. And what can happen is that a particular crystal grows into its natural shape, and it's then surrounded by rock, so it becomes embedded within rock. And then the crystal itself can be dissolved away, leaving a cavity in the rock shaped like the original crystal. And then a crystal of the other kind can start to grow within the cavity, but instead of adopting its natural shape, it takes up the shape of the cavity, so it takes up the shape of the other crystal. So this is pseudomorphosis. It's adopted a shape that is actually false. It's not the true shape of that crystal. And Spengler argues that the same thing happens when a civilization adopts ideas from another civilization. And a particular example of his is Christianity. So Christianity, he says, emerged in his Magian civilization. So it came out of, or its content rather, is Magian. The ideas of Christianity, the original ideas, were Magian. They developed in the Holy Land, in the Middle East, where the Magian civilization existed. So the content of Christianity, the ideas were Magian. But it then developed in this Western context, so or was adopted into this Western context. So the West provided this cavity, this shape within the Magian content developed. And so Christianity took on a form that was thoroughly Western, not its true form as developed in the Magian civilization. So to look at that in a bit more detail, so we've got Christianity, and we've got the Magian civilization here and the Western civilization. And the Magian civilization is typically mystical and ascetic, according to Spengler. Whereas the Western civilization, let's write that a bit better, which, remember, he says is based on a sort of Faustian ideal, so is competitive, and it's about mastery of the world and of the universe, knowledge, gaining knowledge and mastery over nature. Well, he says, if you look in the original ideas of Christianity as expressed by Jesus himself, they were Magian. So they were things like, you know, the saying of Jesus, I am the way, the truth and the life. And also, you know, he advised his disciples to give up their possessions and follow him. So an ascetic ideal. But in the West, Christianity took on a very different form. So that's the kind of original crystal of Christianity. But how it developed in the Western context was things like the great abbeys of the Middle Ages, which were centres of political and economic power. So expressing competition and economic mastery of the world, and also the Protestant work ethic, as people describe, that we serve God by working hard and being self-disciplined and making money. So how Christianity was realized in the West was very different from how it was expressed by Jesus. Jesus expressed a Magian ideal. The West turned that into a Faustian one, Spengler would argue. And so it's in this way that Spengler preserves his idea that although Western civilization is centered around Christianity, which seems to come from an earlier civilization, nevertheless, the two are just entirely separate. One doesn't inherit from the other. One is not later than the other. One is not a development of the other. It's just a thing in its own right. The Magian over here, the Western over there. The fact that one came before or after is neither here nor there. But all the ideas of the West were unique to the West. It took over Christianity, but it didn't take over any of the cultural ideas of the Magian civilization in any way. It was always true to its Western Faustian worldview. And Northcote Parkinson sort of reinterprets this slightly, talking about then Christianity as an Eastern religion coming to the West. So we can see Christianity emerged in the East, in the Middle East, and came to the West. That's Christianity. Parkinson, so this is really just expressing Spengler's idea. He didn't use the terms Magian, but just an Eastern philosophy coming into the West. That's Christianity taken up here. He said, and Parkinson says that Christianity didn't really develop in the East because it didn't bring anything new. It was just expressing philosophical ideas that were already current in the East. So it didn't catch on there. It caught on in the West, where it seemed to offer a new way of thinking about the world and was taken up, but then, as Spengler argues, pressed into the service of Western agendas and ideas about the world. Well, Parkinson says the same thing is true in the opposite direction for Marxism. Marxism arose in the West, but was adopted in the East. So he's particularly thinking about China here. And when China took up Marxism, it did the same thing as the West did to Christianity, where the West squashed Christianity into its own worldview and to serve its own purposes. When the East, China, in other words, took up Marxism, it also squashed it into its own worldview. So Marxism took on the sort of technocratic approach that had always characterized Chinese civilization back in the times of the Chinese emperors and the Chinese civil service, with its civil service exams and its emphasis on scholarship and the ruling of society by experts in the service of an emperor or an autocrat. Well, that's really how Marxism has been adopted in China today. It's the Chinese Communist Party is a set of experts in governing society under implementing a form of autocratic rule, autocratic, technocratic, but certainly not democratic. And Quigley and Quigley and Toynbee have it also talked about this idea of pseudomorphosis. But because Toynbee particularly wants to distance himself from Spengler and not imply that any of his ideas are sort of taken over from Spengler, he expressed it in a different way, and Quigley then, building on Toynbee, did. So Quigley talked about distorted crystals. He said civilizations were like distorted crystals. But his writing on that is not really very clear. And similarly, Toynbee talked about the idea not of crystals, but of a chrysalis. So he was talking about, he's implying that, chrysalis is how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. So one civilization imports a caterpillar in a chrysalis, and then in that civilization it turns into a butterfly. So in other words, the ideas of Christianity that originated in Toynbee's Syriac civilization took on a different form, turned into a butterfly in Western civilization. But I feel that these are firstly attempts to propagate Spengler's thought there without actually expressing the debt to Spengler, and further, they're really not as clear as Spengler's own concept of pseudomorphosis. And just to follow up on this, something I forgot to mention in these ideas of Northcote Parkinson, he said that when Christianity came to the West then took that out to the rest of the world. So to the Americas, to Africa, as missionaries, the West spread Christianity through the world. He says, well, we can expect the same with Chinese Marxism, the Chinese version of Marxism, that it will, as China grows in power and importance in the world, spread its Marxist approach to the world. It's not Marxism, but the Chinese interpretation of Marxism, the technocratic form of rule, to the rest of the world. So China is, spreading those ideas to, say, Africa and South America, and ultimately perhaps to the West. Okay, the second issue I said we'd discuss is the idea that civilizations are instances of reconstitution and renewal of an underlying basic civilization, rather than entirely new things that are starting from scratch. And this is particularly the argument of Alfred Kroeber. So we saw that in the Toynbee-esque type view, there is a Minoan civilization which gave some of its ideas to the classical civilization, so there's an inheritance there. And then the classical civilization gave some of its ideas to the Western civilization, so again, an inheritance of ideas. Well, what Kroeber argues is that the Western civilization we could actually divide into the medieval and modern, and indeed that is what people do. So the medieval period of Western civilization gave way to the modern period. But this was a fundamental transformation. It was a reconstitution of Western civilization. So in the medieval period were the ideas of feudalism, whereas a modern period brought in ideas of liberal democracy. So this was a fundamental change in the institutions of Western society. And we saw in an earlier lesson, in lesson 2.4, when we talked about periodization, about how societies, according to theorists like Pierre Bourdieu, are sets of interlocking institutions. So feudalism was not just one institution, it was a set of interlocking institutions to do with kingship, the church, and the medieval guilds and so on. All these things fitted together in a logical way. And the transition from medieval to modern brought a collapse of all those feudal institutions and the rebuilding of modern bourgeois liberal democratic institutions. So there's a fundamental transformation there. But we considered those both as part of Western civilization. You know, people like Toynbee and Spengler, they have no problem with this idea of a transition from medieval to modern. Well, Koerber says, well, why separate out then the classical as a civilization? Because we can regard this here as also just an example of reconstitution and renewal, like the medieval to modern transition. The classical to medieval transition was similarly a fundamental rethinking of the institutions of society, from, you know, slavery, for example, as a foundation for the economy, to feudalism. So he's asking, you know, why should we see this as any more significant than that? Why should we draw a line there and say that was classical and that was Western, if we don't do that for this division within Western civilization? And indeed, you know, contemporary historians do now refer to this change from the Roman Empire to the Middle Ages as the transformation of the Roman world. This was the title of a European Union project lasting 10 years or so, involving many conferences and academic papers to understand what was traditionally referred to as the Dark Ages, dividing the classical from the medieval period, and is now called the early medieval period, as a period of transformation, not the restarting of civilization, but merely the transformation of an existing civilization, the same way the Renaissance transformed Western civilization. And Koerber then says, well, Koerber, who was working much earlier, we're talking in the 60s, compared to this transformation of the Roman world, which is a project of the 90s, early thousands. But Koerber says, well, why stop there? Then this classical civilization, in fact, really has two phases itself. There was a time when, you know, Greece was the center of the classical civilization, and you had, you know, from Homer to Socrates and Aristotle, they were the leading edge of classical civilization. But then it transferred to the Roman world, which then, you know, conquered Greece and took over and became the center of the classical civilization. So those are two phases within classical civilization. Well, they could be considered like the medieval modern as these phases of an overarching civilization, which he suggests we can call the Western civilization. So if we still accept that the Minoan or Aegean civilization gave rise to the Greek civilization, he says we can call these just different phases. That's Western phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and we're just now in phase 5 of one single Western civilization. And he says similarly for the Middle East and for China. You know, rather than identifying different civilizations in the Middle East, you know, the Sumerian and then the Syriac, then in fact they're all just different phases of this one Middle Eastern civilization. And similarly in China, there are these phases of the one single Chinese civilization. And then he suggests that if we think about the future of Western civilization, people may be thinking that Western civilization is collapsing, coming to its end, declining, They might talk of the fall of Western civilization, like the fall of the Roman Empire, and will lead to the next instance, if you like, of Western civilization. He says it's not actually a collapse, decline, or fall any more than medieval to modern was a collapse or decline or fall. Yes, okay, it was the fall of the medieval world order and the rise of the modern world order, but these were just phases within Western civilization. So while we may feel that Western civilization is collapsing, it's just actually transforming, like the Roman to medieval, the medieval to modern. And it's not the end of the world, it's not the end of Western civilization, it's just a transition to the next phase. And he further says that we can perhaps go into even more detail, because this modern civilization itself could be subdivided here into the early modern and then the true modern. And whereas this was the Renaissance, which transformed the medieval into the early modern, the early modern was transformed to the modern by the Industrial Revolution. And this is starting to suggest that this whole idea of civilizations is not a hard and fast thing, that there are these discrete civilizations, but there are rather these cultural units. And it's, you know, leading to the idea that there's maybe a fractal structure to civilizations, that the largest ones, or the cultural units last for longer or shorter times, and they are larger or smaller. So they maybe vary according to a power law, that there are a few very large ones and many much smaller ones. So it's a fractal or power law situation, that, you know, we can subdivide these cultural units. The largest divisions are what we call civilizations, but within them there are pretty much exactly the same thing, episodes of reconstitution and renewal on all scales. The same way that in the economy we have small recessions, medium recessions, and large recessions or depressions. And the recessions are, as we will be discussing later, although we also saw this in the mathematical module, are episodes of creative destruction that lead to the renewal of the economy. So we've got here episodes of reconstitution and renewal or creative destruction that lead to a reorganization of Western civilization. But the Minoan, the classical, and the Western are just very large reorganizations within a continuum of episodes of reorganization that have a fractal or power law structure. Kroeber's argument here is really very much the opposite of Spengler's, whereas Kroeber here is arguing that these civilizations are just sort of, if you like, syndromes, particular sets of interlocking institutions. So let's put these as that, that's if this is Western 1, Western 2, Western 3, Western 4, these different civilizations, they're sets of interlocking institutions, syndromes within this Western civilization. So it occasionally undergoes reorganization, and but there's a continuous evolution of social and material technologies. So he's saying, indeed, Western civilization phase 3 took forward the social and material technologies of Western civilization too. So and indeed this is the case. This that the technology, even despite things like the Dark Ages, they have it's got better and better through time. So it's Spengler argues that each civilization starts from scratch. Well, Kroeber saying no, it doesn't. There is this continuous evolution, which we can see, and common sense says has happened. We have improved the ways we run our economy and the way we govern ourselves over time, and we've also improved our technological capabilities through time. So it is only about reorganization, not new civilizations that come from nowhere and just start from scratch and then end and disappear into nothingness. No, there is this continuous evolution, that they're just phases within. So there's a kind of punctuated equilibrium of this evolution. Okay, the last issue I said we'd discuss is the idea of Black Athena, which expresses the idea that Greek civilization, the wisdom of Greece, had its roots in black civilization before it got to Greece. So it's associated particularly with a work of that title by Martin Bernal, 1987, multi-volume work. And so we say the typical view of Western civilization that used to be taught in Western civilization courses, say in American universities, was that civilization began in Greece, and from there it went to Rome, and from there it went to Northwest Europe, and from there it went to America. And the point of the Black Athena approach is to point out that Greece did not come from nowhere, and the ideas in Greece did not come from nowhere. They were derived from earlier civilizations. And we know this is the case. For example, we know that Pythagoras' theorem came from Babylon, was known in Babylon 1,000 years before Greece civilization came into existence. So Greece certainly derived ideas from the Middle East, and Greece also took things over from the Egyptians. And again, we know that Greeks traveled to Egypt as merchants, and they also served in the Egyptian army as mercenaries. So let's put that in. We've got Pythagoras' theorem. We've got merchants and mercenaries. Really the other way round, that the Greeks went there as merchants and mercenaries, so they derived through that ideas from Egypt. And the thing is that then it's not a conspiracy, this to suppress this. It's just that in early understandings of Western civilization, people started with Greece, partly because you've got to start somewhere, but also because a lot of this wasn't known until archaeology came along and started to dig up these ancient civilizations and also decode or decipher their ancient languages, their ancient scripts and languages. So the contributions that they had made were simply not known about. So that's why the idea was that it had started with Greece, because that's as far back as people knew. And furthermore, the idea that Greece might have derived ideas from earlier civilizations is perfectly natural. It's entirely natural for people to build on their predecessors. That is how ideas evolve. It doesn't mean that they've simply stolen those ideas. They learn from others, and then they can improve and extend upon those ideas, and then others can take over the baton and improve upon them. So, you know, nothing about this basic idea of Black Athena is really reflecting, as I say, any kind of conspiracy of suppression or reflects anything particularly venal about the behaviour of Greco-Roman civilization. It's just the way things always work and might be expected to work. Then, though, you've got some sort of developments or extensions or strengthening of the thesis, particularly in the idea of Afrocentrism, which is the idea that all this really came from some earlier black, specifically, civilizations, black African, sub-Saharan African. So, you've got the Nubian civilization interacting with and indeed feeding into Egypt. So, Afrocentrism, this ultimately all derives back to ancient, advanced black African civilizations. Now, this is where it starts to become controversial. And some of the claims made, things like the idea that Socrates was black and Egypt colonized Greece. The evidence for these is debatable, let's say. So this is where it starts to become rather politicized, and so let's put that up. It's politicized, as you can imagine, and controversial. So, as theoretical historians, it's something worth knowing about, thinking about, because if there are links back to early black African civilizations, we want to know about them. So it's something we certainly want to be interested in. But we also need to exercise caution with respect to the quality of the evidence for it. Now, the quality of the evidence may improve as new discoveries are made and new arguments are produced. Yes, because it is so political, caution is definitely needed, but it is something we should be aware of. It makes sense to examine these claims, know what they are, and what the evidence for them is. Not just to ignore them, but of course not just to take them over wholesale, but to understand what people are saying and the quality of their arguments, the extent to which they can prove those things. And so I've brought in here some examples of books from my collection in this area, just some examples of some of the literature that one could look at. Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization by Martin Bernal. That's the seminal work on this area. Another one, Black God, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of the Jewish, Christian and Muslim Religions by Julian Baldick. Black Women in Antiquity, Ivan van Sertima. Civilization or Barbarism, An Authentic Anthropology by Sheikh Anta Diop, who's written other books as well. Again, is exploring these ideas. Blacks in Antiquity by Frank M. Snowden Jr. So, these are more or less scholarly books. African Presence in Early America, edited by Ivan van Sertima. And When We Ruled by Robin Walker. And a kind of countercurrent to all this is the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, which is the idea that civilization in Africa, insofar as there is evidence for advanced societies there in the past, was actually brought by outsiders, by the Hamitic race, who in the 19th century were considered to be Caucasian people who came into Africa and built the civilizations there. So this is really the opposite of the Black Athena hypothesis, and that too is extremely controversial and is, considered entirely false by modern academia. Article that sort of provides an overview of the evolution of the Hamitic hypothesis, because in the 19th century it was interpreted, the idea of the Hamitic people, the descendants of Ham, the son of Noah. The Hamitic hypothesis was interpreted as being Caucasian outsiders coming into Africa, but in fact that isn't always how it was understood. So it evolved as scholars brought their prejudices and sought to explain the phenomena that they observed as Europe started interacting more closely with Africa. So the evolution of the Hamitic hypothesis, this is discussed in an article by someone called Edith Sanders, 1969, Journal of African Studies, titled The Hamitic Hypothesis, for if you want an overview of that.